Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. My name is Wagner. I'm probably jet lagged after 30 hours of flight from New Zealand, right? So bear with me. I'm a senior product manager with the Logic Apps team, and we're going to be talking today about how to accelerate developer productivity with Azure Logic Apps, right? So for our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about the developer lifecycle, like how we see the work for a developer working with Logic Apps from onboarding a new computer all the way down to deployment, and then talking about the improvements that we're doing to make that easier for you. And we're going to be concentrating in two areas there, accelerating the developer activities and also increasing the DevOps productivity to make it easier for you to generate DevOps. So when you're talking about like common activities for Logic Apps, right? So if you're a developer working with Logic Apps, most of the things that you see there is probably common. Like you needed to set up a new environment, getting a new machine to set up the extension to be ready to start using that locally, or you needed to bring new code, sometimes from a POC that you did on the cloud, or to get from a new repo. When you're developing, of course, you're creating workflows, but you also needed to potentially extend these workflows with some little bit of code, which you don't have on a connector or something like that. You needed to test those workflows, and you needed to integrate that with source control, right? Then when you're talking about the next step is the application is ready to be used, but it needed to be packaged in a way that is abstract enough to go across different environments. So you needed to set up the project for deployment, abstract some components like the connections. You needed to prepare those deployment scripts for you to be ready to use. And you needed to prepare deployment pipelines on the DevOps platform that you're using. And finally, when you're talking about deployments, you needed to set up those pipelines against the platform. You needed to make sure that those pipelines are working fine, like verify the deployments after you finish. And in most cases, you needed to deploy that against an application that is mission critical. So you needed to make sure that your deployment doesn't affect production. So let's talk about some of the investment areas that we did to help with some of those items. So when it comes to onboarding, as Slava talked on his keynote, we making changes, so now your application is much easier to be set up. Like your extension is much easier to be set up and removes all that requirements for you to know exactly what needs to install and exactly in which version of the frameworks Logic Apps is using. When it comes to development, we're making some improvements on the custom code that is GA since Ignite last year. Right? But now we also bring support for .NET 8 on that. And also we have some new scripting technology inside the designer as well, with C# support inside of the inline scripts. And one of the things that Slava teased on his presentation was the whole testing framework. So how we automate testing for Logic Apps. So we're going to be talking about that. From a packaging point of view, we started to make sure that connections, that was one of our biggest problems, that is usually set up against a live component in production or in a test environment, is now abstracted. So when you started to package that to move for other environments, you don't have to do that yourself. And we also giving you the guidance to generate the deployment scripts. So you don't need to know how to create a ARM template for connections or a pipeline to deploy that. We give you like a really good guidance ready for you to plug on your DevOps platform. Finally, when it comes to deployment, with adding support to those mission critical scenarios by adding support to zero downtime deployment via slots, which is a technology that exists on app services for a while, but now we bring that support for Logic Apps as well. So let's talk a little bit about that onboarding, right? We break down that in many areas. First is the simpler installation. Now, you're going to see that as soon as you install the extension, everything that is required is already installed from a VS Code point of view. You don't need to hunt down which extensions are required as prerequisites. We take care of that for you, and that is if you get a new VS Code new VS Code instance, install Logic Apps is going to be ready for you to use. The other thing we're trying to do is keep it up to date. So not only we install the extensions and the frameworks that are required, but every time that we start VS Code, we're making sure that if we make changes and bring in a new framework, for example, .NET 8, that as part of that verification, we bring this framework for you. And one question that you can ask on this is, where is that installed? How is that not going to clash with my system? We're making sure that that is installed on a portable binary, on a folder specific for your application, decoupled from the system environments, right? Which means that if you're using the same machine to develop .NET and functions and Logic Apps, you're not going to see those clashes that we saw before, because we isolating and making sure that the things that are required for Logic Apps is really well set up, and we take care of that. Then we make sure that the things started at the right time and faster, so for you to be faster to access that. For example, when we started to work with Logic Apps beginning, your designer would only start when you say, hey, can I go to designer, please? And then we waited for a little bit, and then the designer appears. Now we know if you open a Logic Apps project, you're probably going to end up in the designer. So as soon as the project starts, behind the scenes, we start in the designer. We're doing that with a set of components, so making sure that when you needed it, it's ready for you to use, right? And then finally, the last thing that we're doing is bringing that separation of concerns about all the components that you needed to use. We know that even if you're working just on a Logic Apps project, you're never going to be using just the Logic Apps project, right? You have the deployment pipelines that Slava said that we're going to see in a minute. You might have the custom code that we have. You might have a set of tests. What we wanted to do is making sure that all of those components are inside and available for you, but without to be polluting the project area, which is where you have the components that you're probably going to be packaging and pushing out. So you're going to be seeing now the ability of doing those workspaces, and with the workspaces, the ability to create those folders for each one of the components. Okay? So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about custom code extensibility. So one of the things that customers asked before is, how do I extend Logic Apps? How do I make sure that if I needed to do a little bit extra, I don't have to go and create a whole other resource on Azure just to do that, right? And that's what we did, bringing that custom code. Our initial idea was making sure that we bring in that to support a set of legacy components that you might have or might require it when working with bespoke migration. So the initial support for custom code was for .NET Framework, but the first feedback that you get is said, okay, I like custom code, I really want to use it, but I don't want it to be tied up to the .NET Framework because I'm not on the legacy spectrum. I'm actually doing innovation, I wanted to go to the future, right? And that's where what we're doing now is making sure that the same custom code experience that we have with .NET Framework is now supported on .NET 8. Okay? So now we can choose what is going to be the target framework when you're starting. So if you still have legacy applications, you can go and continue using .NET Framework. If you have new applications, you can go and select the .NET 8 when you're creating the workspaces. The next thing that we're doing is making sure that if you really needed to work on a small utility inside of your designer or inside of your workflow, you don't need to go and create a whole project for that. For example, I might just need to zip a file, and I have the code for that. And there's only one of my Logic Apps that is doing that. I don't need to go and create a whole custom code project for that, right? But until now, you need it, unfortunately. So what we're doing with that is extending the inline code support that before was just for C#, for JavaScript, to C# as well. And then you'll be able to create that just as in-app action, insert it as part of your workflow, write the code that you need. It is going to give you dynamic content support, so if you have references from your other actions, it's going to be available there, right? And the audience for that is exactly those customers that are looking for extensibility but doesn't need it, the big footprint that custom code would give it to you, right? Or developers that start development in the portal that are happy to work directly on the designer and be able to do that. So let's see a little demo with that. And before any of my MVP friends talk about it, I selected the chicken way. People that is here for a long time knows what that means. I'm not doing live demos because I have a lot of things to show. Because of that, I recorded everything. With that out of the way, let's go and take a look at this demo. So what we have here is how you can see that custom code extensibility, right? So I have a project that has a file content and a file name. And what I wanted to do is zip that file before I push that I zip that before I put the blob storage. So I selected a C# action, inline action. You see that it's quite similar to that one that we have before for JavaScript. And in here, it's going to give you some boilerplate things so you know where things are and how to use. But what I'm going to do with this one is just replace with the code that I already had, right? And it's basically a little code that goes and zips that. The result of that file, of that action, I can insert on my blob storage. So if I take a look at how that works, once I save this, I can simply run. And then you can see there that I'm going to be adding just a couple of the components like a little binary, and that it finished running, and you have the execution. If I look at my portal now, at my storage account, I have the zip file there, right? And all of that was just the result of that C#. So now if you have like small pieces of code that you needed to integrate or add to your workflow, you can write that directly in the designer, right? If you have more complex scenarios where you needed multiple functions or things that are repeatable across multiple workflows in the same project, you can use custom code. If you have things that you needed to be across multiple logic apps, then you can use custom connector. We give you the full range of really small to reusability across multiple things. Okay, next one is something that probably a lot of people wanted to know a bit more, so let's talk about automating testing for logic apps, right? So before we go and talk about what we're trying to do, let's talk a little bit about what we see that and what we're trying to achieve with this. So the first thing is for us to understand is automate, what is a logic apps unit test? Different from like a little piece of code. Usually when you're talking about logic apps unit test, you're talking about a specific scenario inside of your workflow with very well-defined inputs and outputs, right? So I wanted to test if my order is bigger than blah, what is going to be the result of my workflow? The idea from us is decouple the testing, the authoring and the execution of the test from the logic apps, but also decouple that from external components, right? Because today, the only way for you to test logic apps is testing that live against live items. I wanted to make sure that we improve the productivity by being able to run that test again and again with the same inputs and outputs without me having to write something or do that manually all the time. And improve the quality both locally but also part of my DevOps pipeline. The idea is making sure that whatever you're doing with this automated testing framework, that we can reuse the same engine to run that as part of your pipeline. So you're guaranteed if you have a distributed team of developers, one of them pushed data against the source code, it doesn't impact productivity because you didn't have test coverage to make sure that everything was fine. And the approach that we have, as Slava showed, is meet the developers where it's most comfortable or meet the developers on where the scenario is more appropriate. So we have both a codeless and a Codeful approach to authoring. But both of those components are using the same execution engine behind. That does mean that if you select Codeful and you select codeless, you're going to have different results because behind the scenes, both of them uses the same engine to run the tests, right? And some of the scenarios is like local testing, development lifecycle. So instead of you having to go create a workflow and then test manually, you can write your unit tests and repeat that every time that you're making changes of your workflow. Repeatable testing for the test verification, so getting that same set of things and with the help of your tester, making sure that all the scenarios that you have is there. And of course, test verification as part of your build process, right? So 3 of the target scenarios that we think in when using that. So just talking a little bit more about that approach, the way that we're doing that is having 2 areas, right, front and authoring, both of them interchangeable or be able to push data from one side to the other, usually from the codeless as the first one into the Codeful that you wanted. When you're working with the codeless, you're going to be working just like you're using the normal Logic Apps, and you're going to see that in a minute. So you have your designer that is allow you to create mocks and create user sessions, and that creates a definition file that you can go and run against your execution engine. The result of that execution engine gives a set of reports to say, did it pass or not? And if it didn't, in each one of those, which sessions pass, which sessions fail, right? When it comes to the Codeful approach, what we're giving to you is an SDK to set up mocks and to be able to call that same execution engine to run your Logic Apps with the mocks that you define. The result of that, again, is going to be a set of the result of the workflow that then you can use against the sessions on your unit test framework of choice. Okay? But let's go and take a look on how that works. The first demo that we have here is how can I create a test and how can I define mocks using the codeless approach, because it's what we have in development really close to private preview soon. So I have a Logic App, right? And that Logic App, in this case, it has a HTTP trigger, then it calls an HTTP. Then after that, we have 2 areas to test. We have so on the HTTP, you have a schema associated to that. And let us open let's create a new unit test. So when you create a unit test, just give a name for that unit test, and it's going to get that same definition that you have, the latest version of that definition, and bringing it to the designer for you to be ready to mock, right? So give it a second. Here is the unit test. And you see that I have like 2 items that I can mock. One is the HTTP trigger, right? And because that trigger had a set of schemas, I can actually reuse that schema and show that on the designer. So what I'm going to be doing that is entering the data just like I would be doing this. So just notice that instead of being the inputs, is actually the outputs that I wanted. So I have control about what the trigger information is going to be. Let Wagner in the past stop typing. You see that it also honors the definition of the schema. So for some reason, my total price was integer. If I put a different value, it's going to give you the validation, right? Just like the designer does. Then now I'm going to be writing my HTTP request. And in my case, my HTTP request, I want it to be the 200 and return that file. return that value. I don't have any other actions that can be mocked on this particular logic app, so I just save, and here is the part of the definition. You can see that like those mocks that I created is defined there, so you have full control of how to play with that later. Okay, so this is how you create a unit test from scratch and define some mocks. The next step of that would be authoring assertions, right? So create those assertions. So I open that same unit test that I just created, right, on edit mode. It brings with everything that I had that before. And I have two things that I wanted to test. I have a compose, and I have a set of variables that I define. And for me, this is the logic of that logic app, right? Just let me pause here for a moment. So the logic of my logic apps, in this case, is if I have information, a new message, I wanted to, in this case, I wanted to see if I can allow updating that, right? And in that is like, if I have new or I have update, then I can go and allow processing. It's already in a different stage of the process, already on delivering, or I'm on collecting payment. I don't want it to be updated anymore, right? So my logic is, do I get my variable in the right value after the end of the logic apps? And the message that I send it back to the other application is coming with the right format. And this is what we're going to assert now. Now we can continue playing. So I create in the first assertion. There is assert if that variable is with the right value. And in my case, I want it to be true, right? So you can give the assertion a name, so you can recognize that when you're doing the things, but you also can give you some description, so people that is looking at your logic apps has the documentation out of that. And when it comes to creating the assertions, we're reusing the logic, the workflow definition, right? And reusing all the goods that we have now in the new design or the new expression. So what I did on that first one is just set if the variable is equals true. On the second assertion, what I'm going to do is something similar, but now I needed to test that against a JSON format, right? I wanted to make sure that that compose has the same format that I'm expecting that. So give it a name again, give it another description, and going to do something similar, but now I'm going to get the whole compose and test against a JSON. And you see Wagner in the past didn't know how to type. So let's get the output of that. And now I'm just going to add my JSON and a schema, a message, right? And that's it. Like I created 2 assertions for that workflow and save. So when I finish that, you have a set of assertions there, right? That you can adjust and you can do some other things. But I know that sometimes the data, especially when it comes from data from like something like one of the versions of Service Bus, like the managed connector of Service Bus, for example, that has the data in base64 format, or a large set of data from Dynamics 365 is not going to be as simple to create as my request that I did on the previous one, right? So what we wanted to take, the next thing we wanted to do is making sure that if you already went debugging that and you have already have a run history ready for you to use, because that's how you're doing manual tests before, we can reuse that create to run to create all the mocks, and then you only needed to concentrate on the assertions, because that gives you one scenario that you want to test. And that's what we're doing here. So on this scenario, I get the Logic Apps process message, which is another message on my list. And I have a set there, run history. I could go and create a run straight from there if I want. But in my case, I actually wanted to inspect and make sure that what is the test. So there's a test for a message of status new, right? And I have here, I know that what I'm going to be testing if the output of that was true, so it gets one particular value. So with that, I identify the item, I can go and create a test. And when it creates the test for that, it brings that set with all the components that can be mocked, already mocked, right? So in this case, I got exactly the same result that we had from that trigger from service bus, now mocked here. And my HTTP call that I do to an external system, also done with that, okay? And with the right results. From there, it's just a matter of me going and creating the assertions, right? Concentrate on the assertions, and then use that, okay? For expedience of time, I'm not going to be creating assertions again because we just saw that in the next one. And finally, after you went creating your tests with the mocks and the assertions, the next thing is how I run this, right? We integrated that with the blade, the same test blade that you have on VS Code. So on that blade, you're going to be seeing all the tests that you have, and from there you're able to edit, select one of the unit tests and go to edit. So you can open directly from the blade and do things that you need, right? You'll be able to run that from all the workflows in your workspace, a set of workflows on your project, or for a specific Logic App, or even an individual one. So I'm running that for one set of Logic Apps, right? And full disclosure on that one, I needed to do some edits because I didn't want you guys to wait the paint drying, right? And one of the reasons for the chicken away, I wanted that to be faster for us. So I run that, created 3 Logic Apps, and then after that you see that I can go and select a specific run and see the results. And it's going to be showing me that the report. One of the things that we're working on that is also see the history associated to that. The other thing you can do is also from there, take a look at the actual run, right? So that rounds our codeless approach to run Logic App, to create those unit tests, right? One of the things that I don't have a video here, but probably the next question you have is, what if my Logic Apps change, right? When you open the thing here next time, it's going to represent the new version of the workflow. Those two things at the couple, they just references. So always going to get the latest version. Why? Because you might need to add new mocks to make sure that your test now pass, right? Or you needed to remove mocks to guarantee that that thing is not used anymore. Finally, if I have scenarios that are a lot more complex, right, and I needed to deal with creating those mocks or creating those sessions in a specific way, that's where we have the Codeful approach, right? How we envisage that working is you have a set. First, you would be able to create a set of mocks associated to your Logic Apps directly from the code using an SDK, and you're going to have a set of different ways to do that. You can get an external component where you have the mock, you can write it yourself, or you can actually write a code to get this. And if you're writing code and injecting that as a code, this is not going to be necessarily a static execution. It's going to be like a pointer to that code at the point where the engine is calling that mock, right? So that's going to give me some of the dynamic support where my mock changes inside a loop. Every time that I run that, it should be giving me a different result. That's the kind of thing that it would be really hard to map inside the codeless, but it's going to be possible with Codeful, right? The other thing that the Codeful gives that is like the item 2 is actually a programmatic way to call the execution engine and run that, passing your mock and a workflow definition. Then out of that, you get the result of that workflow execution. Because when you're working with the Codeful approach, you don't want it to use the same kind of assertions that you create in there. You already have a test framework that you're probably using to create those assertions. So what you wanted is that result that you can receive and then be able to use the assertions using your preferred unit test framework. And finally, on item 4, that is just showing that the code, it can be anything and it's going to be running dynamically, so you can create functions associated to that, right? Some disclaimers for that. We are working on the codeless approach, and we're going to have that in private preview really soon. The Codeful approach, we working that on design, so all the principles that you see there, we already did proof of concept to make sure that it works, but we needed to productionize that and push that for you to be able to reuse it. So although this is, no pun intended, a mock code, right? You're going to be seeing something that is really similar to that, but names and things may vary because that was created basically by a Copilot and Wagner. So trust on the principles, don't trust on the code because it was Wagner that wrote it, okay? If you're interested in any things that you see, please join our private preview. We're planning to run that private preview by end of June, right? So we're closing some of the things, just like tidying up some of that. And we having an expression of interest for that private preview available. So you can like go to Logic App, AKMS Logic App Standard DevX test private preview, or just get a copy of that QR code that worked on my machine. That's a guarantee. So with that, we finished, no, I kidding. With that, we just finished the test automation part, but we still have other things to do, right? So far, we onboarded, we created the development, we extended, we tested. So the next thing that we needed to do is how we're going to be packaging that, how we're going to be pushing this to other environments, right? And with that, that's where we got this deployment scripts generation tool in public preview, right? This thing actually started even before you right-click and generate the deployment scripts. The first thing it does is making sure that when you're creating connections, which I think probably everyone that tried to do that agrees that was one of the biggest pains to actually abstract and push to other environments, that those connections are abstracted at the time that you create the connection, right? So you don't need to do that before. It creates that as part of the creation of the connection. What happens if I have like a project that already have a whole lot of connections? When the project starts, similar to that same kind of validations that we do, we identify that you have a connection with items that it needs to parameterize and ask you if you're doing that. We're not forcing that because we know that if you already have projects in place, most probably you already did something else to get that to other environments if you're not right-clicking deploy, right? So you opt in on that. But our deployment script generation is going to take this in consideration, so it's only going to work on that, right? If the connections are parameterized. But we don't stop you from working the way that you're working if you don't want to use those tools. You might start using those tools in new projects, for example. And then after that, retrofit to others. But what we do with that, we create in-tooling gesture for the script generation. So right-click on Logic Apps, generate deployment scripts. And from that, it creates a set. It asks some questions. It's a wizard-like. It creates a set of artifacts for you, like the infrastructure scripts for connectors and Logic Apps, the deployment scripts, pipelines for infrastructure, CI and CD, and also the configuration files like your workflow parameters for the cloud, right? The tools that we're supporting today are we're creating that first for Azure DevOps using YAML, right? Because based on our research, that's the biggest footprint that we have today. And we created based on ARM templates, because if you're using Bicep, then I give you ARM templates, you're able to get to that, for example, right? And again, ARMS was still the biggest footprint that you have on our research. That doesn't mean that we're going to stop there. We're going to talk a little bit more about that on the roadmap. So let's take a look at that for real. So the first thing that is showing that, like I have a connection, that service bus connection, and I created that using a managed connector on purpose, right? So when you go to the connections.json, you can see that those connections are actually parameterized when the connection was created, right? With a set of the app settings and the parameters. So you see connections URL is with parameters. So if I go to the parameters, now I have two components there. I have my authentication, and I have a pointer to my connection runtime URL. Okay? That authentication is going to be important. We're going to see how we're dealing with local versus cloud thing later. So now that you see the connection parameterization, let's go and generate those deployment scripts. So with that, let's wait it for the load a little bit. So I selected a script. You see that I put in actual values there. The reason for that is my scripts are going to work from the point where you finish this, right? So I give in a set of things for the subscription, the name of the logic apps, the name of the storage, the name of the ASP, right? The service, the compute. And when I finish that, if I get those scripts straight away, it's going to work. But we put all of that in variables. So when you push that to DevOps and you're trying to get that across the, different environments, you can just go and change the variables to get that to different environments. So when that finishes and is just running, I'll trust that, of course. And you see that it created a deployment folder inside the workspace, separate from the project, back to that idea of the workspace giving separation of concerns, right? On that, the first thing that we did is in the infrastructure, you have a set of ARM templates. So this one is the ARM template for the logic apps with all the dependencies that you have, right? And all the parameters that you need to run this. Then I have one thing for the service bus. Let me do another quick pause here. So we're going to be creating a connection for each one of the connections that you have. So you have that separated. But you see that when you deploy, you have just one task to deploy all of that. Okay? But while we're here, you see that it's also taking in consideration all the requirements that you have for making sure that the ACLs are created properly, and the service bus parameterization, or all the parameters that you needed to create a service bus. All right? So next, let's take a look at the same parameters. Next, take a look at the pipelines that it creates. So in here, we have the infrastructure pipeline, where we're going to be doing the deployment of the logic apps. Right, and then that is just using a normal ARM. But then we're creating a specific connector to guarantee that if connector is already deployed, it doesn't mess up that unless it have changes. And also deploy all the connectors that you have in your list. Then from a build point of view, we create a new task because we didn't have that first class support. So we have a task for build, right? And you finish that, just publish. And finally, from the CD point of view, on the variables. So we have all the variables for you to change across different environments. And then from the CD pipeline, we also have a deploy or release task for that. Okay? And again, same things. If you needed to add your own app settings, you're able to. We just get the information that you had on the application so far. List of the parameters with all of those. So next thing that we show to you is the parameters.json. And one of the things that you're going to notice there is like a list of all the parameters, including the other parameters that I had. But one that is quite important there, let's see if I select this, is the service bus connection. I changing the authentication from local with keys to managed identity because now that is targeting the cloud. So you don't have to deal with that anymore. All of that is part of the deployment package. Okay? From here is a matter of you pushing that to source control, connecting those pipelines on your deployment, on your Azure DevOps, and start running or adjust it for the things that you want. Finally, zero downtime deployment support, right? So if you're doing that, you also, and you're working with mission critical, we also wanted to make sure that this is deployed to a slot, so you can do guarantee that the code that you put in there, one, doesn't impact production or doesn't have an error to impact production, but two, is swap without the application being with an outage, right? So for that, you'll be able to use that slot support on the portal, using CLI or using scripting templates. And we have some guidance on how to create deploy swap on MS Learn, right? There are some limitations here today. The first one is that the Logic App Standard slot are read only, and that was done on purpose, right? When you're talking about this kind of scenario, different from an application where everything is always request response, someone needed to initiate a request for you. On this case, we're going to have things that are actually listeners to an environment or running on a schedule, right? We didn't want your code that is on the staging slot to bleed into the production yet until you say that it's swapping. So we're creating that on read-only on purpose. We're working on other scenarios depending on the customer feedback. What other scenarios you wanted to see? You wanted to see blue-green deployments. You wanted to see A/B testing, right? And how to achieve that. But we needed your feedback for this. Not all commands are available on the Logic App Standard CLI yet, but we're working on that, but it doesn't stop you today because what we don't have on the Logic App Standard, we have on the function CLI, which they are really close together, right? And the two things that now that we have that in place that we're doing is making sure that the release task that we created has support for slots, and because of that, the scripts that we create also have support for a slot. So for that one, I created another demo as well, but I went down to the portal route so you can actually see in the portal the things that are happening, right? And I deploy me using some of the tooling that we have on VS Code. I know that friends don't let friends right-click deploy, but that is a special case. Okay, so first of all, we have an application where we have two workflows, right? And that's in production. So I have a new version of that. That is that one that we're working. That is totally going to change this. For that, what I wanted to do is making sure that I'm deploying that first to a stage, slot. So I have one slot created, right? If I go to that slot right now, you're going to see there is nothing on the workflows. So it's a fully empty slot, right? So now, when it opens, yes, nothing there. So swap to VS Code, that same code that we worked, that went from all the way to testing, I'm going to deploy here using Logic App. So I selected what is my application, what is my slot, right? And it's going to be running just like as deploying a normal application. So the things that we're doing here, behind the scenes, we're using the same APIs that the CLI uses for you to deploy on the pipeline, okay? So run a little bit, finish this the setting up the stage, update the settings as we require, right? I just not getting the duplicated ones. So As soon as that finishes, when you come back to the staging, you're going to see now that those two logic apps that we had, that we created, tested, and the setup is there. And for example, it's ready, but you see that there is no workflow URL there, right? Which is that what we're saying is read-only. Okay? So, but everything has been deployed on this stage. So what I should be doing now is going back to my application and say, I'm happy with that, or as happy as I can be. Go back to deployment and let's swap that. So if I go and swap, it's going to be asking what is the target and the source, right? Asking questions about what I should be keeping from the app settings. And after it finished swapping, I can go now to my main one, that is the production, and you're going to see that those two logic apps that we created is there. If I go back to my slot, you see that now the old production code is on the staging, which guarantees that, like, for any reason I needed to roll back, I still have access to that, right? So it works pretty much like you would expect it from the slots, right? With that caveat that the staging is always going to be read-only for good purpose. So finally, let's talk about a little bit about what's next, what's coming after that, right? So first, from onboarding, the two areas that I think that is like the next two big things for us to tackle, that is like pain points or the cuts when you're working with logic apps, is if I started my POC on the cloud, how do I bring that to Visual Studio Code to take advantage of all those things and actually bring that in a way that already taking advantage of the workspaces, and then because of the workspaces, all that goodness that we're doing. So we're creating like a seamless way for you to get a package from the portal and say, import it into a new workspace, right? We're doing that work right now. The second one, that is probably the thing that annoys a lot of people today. I was talking to someone this morning just about that, and is, what happens after 7 days with my managed connections? No one? The connection dies, right? The ACL, actually the connection doesn't die, but the ACL key dies, and because of that, we don't have an easy way to regenerate that. Can run APIs and get that, but that is a big paper cut, right? It's like a paper gash. So what we're doing with that is making sure that the same way that when you started the application, we take all those validations, we also validate the connection, and if the connection keys are expired, we just regenerate new ones and insert it there. Or, which is another case, I got my code from source control, and because of that I didn't put app settings there. I need new keys to be created as part of that process, right? So those two things are going to be there. From a deployment point of view, the areas that we're going to be working is, as I said before, now that we have the basic of a logic app project creating the deployment script, what are the other things that we needed to include on there? We needed to include support for slots. We needed to include support for the custom code. So it doesn't matter what type of project you are or the type of target that you have, that tool give you the right guidance and is going to be asking as part of your process, right? Then after that, the other things that we are, or not after that, but the other things that we're also investing on is what are the other types of deployment scripts, Bicep, Terraform, that we're going to be working, right? And what is the other platform? The next biggest platform is GitHub Actions. So making sure that when you add on that tool, doesn't matter what is the target or your scripting scripting technology, it supports you on that. From testing, as I said, we wanted to enable that support for Codeful that you right now in design. We wanted to make sure that you have access to that, right? Our initial plan is that if everything goes according to plan, making sure that when you go to public preview, you don't have to choose one version of the other. You have access to both of them, right? It doesn't make sense to go to public preview just of Codeless or just of Codeful. You have the choice there. But also the enable that CLI support for test execution of the pipeline. So Right now, you're running all of that on VS Code. Next step is, if you have this and needed to push to your pipeline, you have an easy way to do that, and probably a task that just says run the tests. Then finally, from an extensibility point of view, with all the AI, like all that the AI wave, one of the things that you're probably going to want is the ability to create custom code now using Python, right? Because that is like the main language that you have for that. Okay? So this is the end of the things that I have to discuss. But before that, I have two things that you probably wanted to keep an eye. The first one is we're going to be doing a Logic Apps Community Day in September. And that is going to be a full day of presentations, both from us and product group, but also from the community, right? So keep an eye on that. If you have some good ideas or did some interesting things, please go to that community day, because you have the call for speakers open right now. The next one is, how do you keep track of all of those things that you're doing? It's like we're going to have 3 sessions full of announcements. How you keep track of that? How you keep track of that between integrates, right? This is what the Logic Apps Aviators is a community initiative that we created that allow you to participate, but also find the latest information. 2 things that we do regularly is we have a Logic Apps Live every 4th Thursday of the month, right, 11 a.m. PST. So it depends on where you are. It's kind of hard, but I saw people joining both 5 a.m. New Zealand time and like midnight, sometimes London time. So keep coming, keep adding the comments and things. And the other thing that we do is also a newsletter that you find every month on our AIS Tech Community blog, with all the information that we collated from the month about Logic Apps announcements, new customer stories, and also community articles. So if you've been writing blog posts about Logic Apps and you've been amplifying that, please add the Logic Apps Aviators hashtag on your amplification, on your social media, because we're using that to find out new articles to publish that. Okay? And I think now is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.